Hi everybody, you've got two video tutorials this week, one focusing on just some writing tips and reminders for general ideas when writing about the humanities, and then you've got a second video tutorial that looks more specifically at writing support and MLA as well, and research support. So I wanted to just go through a few tips and tricks and reminders to keep in mind as you're continuing to work on your final paper and you're getting feedback from your instructor on milestone 2 and you're revising and editing things. First tip is to remember to help your reader to see. So in other words, think about that visual description for your works of art, especially your visual works of art, and imagine that first viewing. So don't assume that your instructor is perfectly clear on what it is that you see in that work of art. You want to really imagine for a moment that you're showing it to someone who's never seen it before. This is their first view. So you're really getting a good, clear visual description. This will help you, as well as your reader, really focus in on some of the details that are going to support your points later on in your paper. So look at the formal qualities using those vocabulary terms and concepts from MindEdge that we've been working with from the weeks up till now, as well as specific details in your particular works of art. And then your analysis, too. This is where you bring in your context and research. So this is where you show off the knowledge you've gained as far as what you've learned in MindEdge, the terms and the concepts of putting works of art into their context, as well as showing off what you're bringing in from your own research sources to help us see how your specific works of art are examples of their time period and how they reflect that theme that you're looking at. Those thematic connections come into play here as well. So the research and the context that you're bringing in as far as placing your works of art in their time period help you make that thematic connection even clearer. Tip number 2, stay on track. This is one that I like to remind everybody because you've got a lot going on here in this paper. You've got a lot of things that you're sort of juggling here. So at the heart of your paper, do make sure that you really stay focused on your two main works of art. I say this because you're looking at history, you're looking at concepts of what was happening socially, politically, depending on your theme. You've got a lot of different elements in your paper, and it can sometimes be easy to get sidetracked and sort of veer off course, and your paper could turn into a history paper, or it could turn into a psychology paper or something like that. And you really want to keep it focused on your two works of art to keep that sort of humanities element at the core. So keep asking yourself, what do I see? When and where are we when we're looking at a particular work of art? What time period am I in? And then you also want to kind of always ask yourself, is what I'm talking about right now directly related to my thesis? There's this easy sort of sidetrack that a lot of us can take as far as a biography or sort of stories and anecdotes go, because it's interesting, especially when we find an intriguing story about an artist or something surrounding the work of art when it was created, and suddenly you can find yourself going off on a tangent of several paragraphs where you're talking about who this artist was, who he married, how many children he had, and so forth, and it doesn't necessarily relate back to your thesis. Sometimes those things can support your thesis, but you want to make sure you really are asking yourself whether or not it directly relates. Keep that thesis in mind, kind of keep bringing yourself back to your thesis and saying, okay, is the bulk of this paragraph that I'm working on right now really directly related to what my main goal is in this paper? Or am I getting off on an entertaining but definitely off-course tangent? Perspective, when I say perspective here, this has to do with the first person, using I think, or I feel. Depending on when you went to school, where you went to school, and so forth, there's differing views on this. For a long time, many of us were told, never use I, never say I believe or I think in your paper. But that sort of idea has changed a bit now. And in general, most instructors are fine with your using I, using the first person. But remember to stay objective. So in other words, as long as you are stating, I am going to be discussing this topic in my paper, or I found that this element in the painting really reflected the theme well, then you're fine, as long as it's not becoming just I like this, or I find it beautiful, or I enjoyed exploring this work of art. So ask yourself, am I making a subjective analysis of the work? Because that's going to happen. We're looking at works of art, of course. We're going to have personal and individual interpretations that come into play. And that's fine, again, as long as it's balanced with an objective use of research and the goals of the paper itself. So you don't want it to be a personal paper, a personal reflection, or a personal interpretation of a work of art. With that in mind, stay objective. Some of you, depending on what theme you're using and what works of art you have, you might have a tricky subject or issue. If you've got an issue or a theme that deals with religion or faith, for example, or gender, something that could be particularly tricky. Again, you don't want to assume. You want to kind of approach it objectively. Don't assume that your reader has the same religious beliefs as you, or same background as you, or the same concepts that you have on a potentially tricky issue. And always make sure you have some research to back it up. So that's another way to make sure you're staying objective and it doesn't just turn into a kind of a personal bent on a particular topic. Remember that this paper is really a comparison and contrast paper. When we say thesis statement, we kind of use that term loosely. It's not like a typical English composition paper where you're writing an argument. You're not trying to argue for one side or another and using your research to prove your point. That's not really what you're doing here in this paper. So you're really comparing and contrasting and thinking of this overall larger picture of how these two works of art reflect their different time periods, but also share the same theme. So you don't want to think about it necessarily as an argumentative paper where you're trying to prove a point, so to speak. Tip number 5, technical details. Remember to proofread, proofread, proofread. And that's everything from little details like spelling, typos, and formatting, as well as overall clarity and organization. So in addition to running spell check, which is a good thing to do, of course, you want to really look carefully at your paper overall, as well as in those smaller details. One way to do this would be to read it out loud, and you can kind of hear and catch any mistakes that might come up that you might not otherwise catch when you're looking at the computer screen. You could have someone else read it aloud to you or have someone else read it for you, and always having another set of eyes can help point out areas that might not be clear. So in addition to those smaller elements like spelling and typos, does the paper itself flow? Your rubric gives you a good sort of outline of how to organize your paper and how it'll go section by section and paragraph by paragraph. But even within that, you want to make sure it kind of flows and transitions nicely between those sections. And then MLA formatting. So like I said, there's a whole other video tutorial this week that focuses on different support that you have out there for MLA. But remember that MLA refers to your overall paper, so the margins, the spacing, the overall format and look of your paper, as well as the specific ways that you're including your research with your parenthetical citations and works cited entries. So keep that in mind. MLA is probably nobody's favorite part of writing a paper, but it's an important one both to keep your paper organized and to make sure there's no question about where you brought in research and your sources to avoid any kind of concerns that have to do with plagiarism. So make sure you check out the other video this week that points you in the direction of lots of resources to help you with MLA and research and writing.